good afternoon, or perhaps morning or evening, depending where you are in the world. Um, Welcome back to the fifth NNP Symposium. We are here for this presentation with Douglas Mudd. And Douglas, you're welcome to go ahead and turn on your camera and unmute yourself. Got there before I'd finished saying the little sentence. All righty. As always, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you are welcome to send those in with the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can send them in at any time, but we will not be answering them until the end of the presentation. So for this one, we're going to learn about colonial currency of German East Africa with Douglas Mudd. And if you're not familiar, Douglas Mudd is the curator and museum director at the ANA. So we're quite honored to have him here with us. And I believe that's it for me. Douglas, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Leanna. Yeah, today we'll take a little jaunt through East Africa, an area that I've always been fascinated with, and an area which is interesting because there's not much really known about it. It's fascinated me because of its location in one of the last regions of the continent to be explored by Europeans. And, you know, the old phrase of darkest Africa referred to Central Africa and East Africa equally for many, many decades during the 19th century and before. And his exploration was the stuff of legends. And that's what got me into it in the first place. The search for the source of the Nile, for example, Henley Morton Stanley, David Livingstone, Richard Burton, John Speke, Samuel Baker, and the stories of their adventures were all things that I read about. And my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, for example, did a safari in East Africa just before World War I. And at some point, I hope to do a photo safari. It's on my bucket list anyway. But all of these played a major part in developing my interest in the region. A later interest was added as I discovered further amazing stories associated with World War I, stories alluded to in movies such as The African Queen or Out of Africa, about the guerrilla war carried out in the colony from 1914 to 2 weeks after the end of the war with the armistice in November of 1918. Then I discovered the numismatic background of what was to become Tanzania, and my interest was further piqued yet again. So today I ask you to follow me on this numismatic and historical exploration of a fascinating region of the world. Well, prior to the mid-19th century, the coast of East Africa was colonized by Arab slave traders. The Portuguese had left centuries before when they discovered there wasn't much to be had there other than keeping a fort here or there along the coast. The Arab slave traders moved in and they settled along the coast, venturing into the interior with their caravans in search of slaves. As they began to penetrate further and further into the interior, they also discovered ivory, which in time became as important to their commerce as the slave trade. Tabora and Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika became the most important trading posts along these routes. In East Africa during the early to mid-19th century, there was no central authority large or powerful enough to establish a universal currency standard. Nevertheless, there appeared a monetary standard of sorts over the course of the century as Arab slavers, Indian merchants, and Omani Zanzibari sultans increased their influence in the region. This standard was based on the use of cowrie shells, Indian rupees, and Maria Theresa thalers. All three were introduced from abroad through trade. Cowrie shells from the islands of the Indian Ocean, Maria Theresa thalers through Arab traders, and Indian rupees through the Indian merchants that began setting up shop during the 1860s and onwards in the East African region. English explorers in the 1870s, used to the dominance of English coinage in much of the continent, were shocked to learn that natives in East Africa refused to accept gold sovereigns. How could they not accept gold sovereigns? Well, they didn't recognize them, and they wanted Maria Theresa thalers instead, along with cowrie shells, with the result that the Royal Mint produced thalers for a short period, as did some of the mints in British India, Bombay and Calcutta. The first Europeans to show an interest in colonizing East Africa were missionaries of the London-based Church Mission Society, Explorers were also active in their attempts to locate the source of the Nile River, thus stimulating additional interest in the region. These geographical explorations probed deeper and deeper into the interior, eventually leading to the discovery of Lake Victoria and Lake Nyassa by Richard Burton and John Speke. These men were soon followed by well-known adventurers such as David Livingstone and Henry M. Stanley. Despite the presence of British missionaries and explorers, the British government showed little interest in claiming or colonizing the region due to its lack of valuable resources readily available and the hostile climate of its coastal region, combined with the diseases and the presence of the deadly tsetse fly in the central coastal and nearby regions, which basically meant that horses and cattle were pretty much not able to live in those areas because the tsetse fly was deadly to them. So British interest was restricted to suppressing the slave trade in the areas where they could reach along the coast and controlling the Sultan of Zanzibar, who was the nominal ruler of the region from his capital in Zanzibar. So we'll look at the map here for a little bit. The Germans, the latecomers to colonialism, were able to stake claims to huge areas of Southwest, East, West, and the Gold Coast of Africa during the last decades of the 19th century. They acquired these territories with the approval of the so-called Great Powers who met in Berlin in 1884 to 1885. In 1884, at the request of Portugal, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called together the major European powers to discuss control of Africa. The idea was to limit the possibility of a major European war by creating spheres of influence in Africa as the competing nations carved out their colonial claims. 14 countries were represented at the conference on November 15th, 1884. They were Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, which was joined at the time, Turkey, and the United States. France, Germany, Great Britain, and Portugal were the major players in the conference with the most interest in developing or protecting the colonies they already had. At the time of the conference, 80% of Africa remained under local rule. What ultimately resulted was a rush to acquire African colonies that resulted in a hodgepodge of geometric boundaries that divided Africa into 50 colonies. This new map of the continent was superimposed over the old tribal and cultural boundaries and regions of Africa. The new countries divided the coherent groups of people and merged together disparate groups with the results that are still felt today. The only native regions to remain independent by 1900 were the Kingdom of Abyssinia and the state of Liberia. German East Africa was located in Eastern Africa in what is now part of modern Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. The Germans first laid claim to these territories in 1885 when the Deutsche Ostafrikanische Gesellschaft, German East Africa Company, was formed to colonize and exploit the resources of the region. In East Africa, Germany, working with Great Britain, who had major contacts and also naval support in the region, to consolidate their hold on the claims that they had made. These efforts began in 1884 when Dr. Karl Peters, one of the founders of the German Colonization Society, set out for East Africa in search of a suitable colony. In November of that year, Peters succeeded in concluding a series of treaties with the local chiefs. Kaiser Wilhelm II accepted these somewhat questionable claims as valid, and the German government declared a protectorate over the area in 1885. The German East Africa Company, Deutsche Ostafrikanische Gesellschaft, as it was called in German, was organized to administer the newly acquired colony. It was independent of the government and was treated as an independent private enterprise. At that time, the Sultan of Zanzibar also held vaguely substantiated claims to territory on the mainland, basically through Arab and Muslim traders. In 1891, after several major native uprisings against the company, abuses, and lackluster progress, Germany took direct control over the German East Africa and made it a colony of the German Empire. This is somewhat reluctant but in order to save face and save German reputation, the German reputation in Africa and abroad, it was thought necessary that rather than abandon the colony, Germany must take a direct hand. By 1898, they succeeded in occupying all of the interior. These claims were eventually recognized when a joint British and German agreement was reached to end the Sultan of Zanzibar's claim within German East Africa. And you can see the result here on the map. You've got the capital at Dar es Salaam, which was a great port. It had a very good harbor and was developed quite a bit during this period. And then you have the map of the colony, which was three times the size of Germany at the time. So this is a huge area, and it's characterized by different geographic zones. Basically, it's east to west. You have the hot savanna bounded by coastal swamps in the east. This is the area where the tsetse fly and other tropical diseases were prominent, which made it very deadly for Europeans and non-Africans to visit and or live there, but also meant that for certain areas within the central portions of the colony, horses and domesticated cattle didn't survive. The tsetse fly was extremely dangerous to them. Then you had the temperate Central Highlands, which were very comparable to European conditions in parts of Germany and in the Alpine regions of northern Italy and Austria, and very welcoming to European settlers, and that's where most of the settlers ended up going. And the lake region in the west, bordered by jungle in the north and the forest in the south. Lake Tanganyika is a huge lake, over 300 miles long and well, 400 miles long with 80 to 100 miles wide. So it's a huge inland sea that formed the western boundary of the area. So the German East Africa Company, we're going to go back a little bit, quickly set about establishing plantations and improving the harbor at Tanga on the northern coast and beginning a railroad from there to Mount Kilimanjaro in the north of the colony, which was an area that was very European-like and the most attractive to the potential colonists, and plus the safest as far as the diseases and other problems. Development was slow, however, as the company was unable to raise sufficient funds for development, and the German government had no particular interest in funding what they considered to be a private enterprise. At first, sisal was the colony's most valuable crop, and it was soon to be followed by coffee, rubber, and cotton. But it remained a problem that the colony was not making money. It cost much more to administer than any profit that the company was able to make. So in April 1888, the company leased the coastal strip opposite Zanzibar from the Sultan of Zanzibar for 50 years. Its attempt to take over the administration of the area, however, led to a general revolt along the coast of what is now Tanzania. The company could only hold Dar es Salaam and Bagamoyo, the two major cities of the time, with the help of the German Navy. In 1889, it had to request the direct assistance of the German government to put down the rebellion, which was largely the result of their own mismanagement and the brutal treatment of the natives, though they had successfully abolished slavery throughout the colony. Well, soon after the organization of the company, it was realized that a more diversified coinage than the Maria Theresa thaler and the use of the cowrie shell was required to grow commerce in the colony. In order to facilitate international trade, the thalers then in circulation were fixed at 3 German marks. In order to create a colonial currency, the German East Africa Company established in 1890 an exchange rate based on the pesa. The pesa, or pice, long familiar to Arab and Indian traders, was assigned the value of 64 paisa to 1 rupee. This coin was minted for 3 years from 1890 to 1892 before being dropped in favor of a new currency tied to the German mark. Here's an example of a peso from 1890. It has Arabic on the reverse and the German imperial eagle on the obverse, along with the name of the company, showing that the company was responsible for its issue. In 1891, the relationship between the company rupee and the German mark was fixed at 1 rupee equals 1.33 marks, i.e. 4 marks is equal to 3 rupees. The name rupee was adopted for colonial use to distinguish the coinage from the Indian and other rupees then in circulation. Rupee was spelled R-U-P-I-E as opposed to R-U-P-E-E as used by the English and others. Silver coins in denominations of quarter, half, 1 and 2 rupee were struck over the next few years. They were minted in Berlin of 0.917 silver and to a common design. The obverse featured Wilhelm II in military dress wearing a helmet with a German eagle perched on top. The legend surrounding the bust of Wilhelm II reads William II Emperor. The reverse bears the arms of the German East Africa Company, consisting of a lion and palm tree with a date underneath. The description surrounding the central shield reads Deutsche Ostafrikanische Gesellschaft, with value expressed in rupees below. So this is handsome coinage by colonial standards and was relatively successful, though at first issued in fairly small numbers. The 2 rupee was dropped after just a couple of years, making it one of the great rarities of the series. Production of this series commenced in 1891 and lasted until 1904, when the final company rupean coins were struck. Some years saw no mintage figures, as the coins were struck only to meet the demands of existing commerce. Mintage figures for German East Africa Company coins are low as compared to the later government issues that followed after 1904, making them relatively expensive today. By 1891, the German government realized that the East Africa Company was unable to manage a colony and was on the verge of being defeated by local rebels. The imperial government, anxious to avoid international embarrassment and to exploit the colony's potential, declared a protectorate over the region formerly ruled by the German East Africa Company, and settled the financial accounts with the colonists and natives, and immediately took over the colonial administration, forming a professional police force known as the Schutztruppe. The most important work involved completing the railroad from the northern port of Tanga to the plantations near Mount Kilimanjaro, a project that had been going on for a number of years, but with little progress because of lack of funding. And then the use of government funds to crush rebellions and begin a systematic development of the economy. In 1897, the imperial government renamed the region the Colony of German East Africa, Deutsches Ostafrika, aka the DOA. Shortly afterwards, a colonial department was set up in Berlin to assist in development. From 1904 onwards, financial management of the colony was taken over by the imperial German government. In 1906, in the wake of the Maji Rebellion and the revelation of the continued brutality of the colonial administration, a complete rehaul of the colony was instituted, starting with the creation of a new German colonial office, supported by a colonial training school in Germany, which developed a new ethos of treating the natives with greater respect in order to gain their support and partnership in developing the colony, which was a milestone in colonial relations among any of the European countries. The idea that the natives should have a part in their own fate and the fate of their country was novel. They enforced new laws protecting the property of the natives and reducing the abuses. The native situation was further improved by the establishment of a postal system, compulsory education of native boys, and the elimination of smallpox and other diseases through an intensive program to vaccinate the native population, which was supplemented by the development of a first-rate research institute dedicated to researching tropical diseases and the development of new products from tropical plants. This institute became unique for its time and was immensely important in the development of many remedies and not necessarily cures, but things that could be done to mitigate the tropical diseases that appeared in those areas during the just before World War I and then after World War I, because the institute was still in existence under the British. So they developed treatments for sleeping sickness and other diseases associated with the tropics. Unrest in the colony dropped dramatically after 1908, with over 1,000 schools created, as opposed to no public schools in British East Africa or most of the rest of the colonial Africa at the time. So it was very progressive for the period. On the eve of World War I, the colony was dramatically improved socially, economically, and militarily, becoming a model of enlightened European colonialism with bright prospects for the future. Dar es Salaam was a model colonial capital, which on the eve of the war, literally in June of 1914, celebrated a major event in celebrating the colony itself at the time of the completion of the Central Railroad, which went from Dar es Salaam all the way to Lake Tanganyika, opening up Central Africa to the rest of the world in a way that hadn't been done before, except through Belgian Congo. This meant that the colony was on the verge of great success just as the war started, and was in need of money. And this is where we'll talk a little bit more. So the DOA monetary system consisted of silver rupee coins and fractions. In replacing the pesa, which was just a one pesa coin with no other bronze pieces and was supported by the cowrie as had been in the past, a complete series of subsidiary coins were developed to support the earlier existing silver coinage. So the subsidiary coinage of the Heller denomination, which was used to distinguish them from the pfennig used in the fatherland, was developed. The Heller was valued at 100 Heller equals 1 rupee, thus decimalizing the system. DOA coins eventually consisted of 12 types. The first of the new DOA coins were minted starting in 1904 in the following denominations: the half, 1 Heller, quarter, and half, and 1 rupee pieces. They were initially supplemented by a bronze half and 1 Heller. The obverse of the silver rupee coins was unchanged from the German East Africa Company issue. New dies were cut for the reverses, consisting of the value, i.e. 1 rupee, in the center, surrounded by crossed palm fronds with Deutsche Ostafrika above and date with mint mark below. The bronze Heller denominations depicted the imperial crown at the center with Deutsche Ostafrika above and date below on the obverse, and value surrounded by crossed laurel branches on the reverse. So you can see the examples of the different coins here. So this meant that there was a complete series of coins ranging from the 1 rupee down to a half Heller, thus providing the ability to completely monetize all the transactions needed in the colony from the lowest to the highest. The new 5 Heller bronze and 10 Heller copper nickel coins were added in 1908. In 1913, the bronze 5 Heller was replaced by a much smaller copper nickel type with a center hole. A similar 10 Heller copper nickel piece was struck from 1909 to 1914. So you get an idea of the different types of coins. The 10 Heller pieces were quite large, basically roughly dollar size, slightly smaller than a dollar, but bigger than a half dollar size. All pre-World War I coins were minted at Berlin and Hamburg mints in Germany. Coins minted in Berlin carried the A mint mark, while those in Hamburg were struck with a mint mark J. In some years, production was assigned to both mints for the same coin to keep up with demand. Mintage figures for Heller coins ran into millions per year for each denomination, while the silver rupee issues seldom exceeded 500,000 for each denomination. Private paper money was issued from the beginning of the colony to make up for the lack of small change. Private notes were issued by the German firms in Bagamoyo, Dar es Salaam, and Zanzibar. Emergency notes were issued during the Maji Rebellion of 1903 to 1904, including postal currency, ship money for the squadron which patrolled the coast, and military credit notes, along with private plantation notes, all of which are quite rare. The German East Africa Bank, or Deutsche Ostafrikanische Bank, was formed to serve the colony in 1904. The right to issue banknotes was granted on 15 January 1905, and soon after, the first paper money was introduced. These notes were produced by the Leipzig firm of Gisecki and de Vriant on special paper with the company's cross and star watermark pattern. 5, 10, 50, and 100 rupiah notes were issued. In 1912, a 500 rupiah note was added. These were issued in Dar es Salaam and featured the following common elements: red serial numbers, Deutsche Ostafrikanische Bank at the top, the value in writing and numerals, and the printer's name appearing in the lower right border on the front. The 5 rupiah banknote has an engraving of a lion and lioness in the veld. The 10 rupiah note shows a harbor view of Dar es Salaam with a ship at anchor, and the 50, 100, and 500 rupiah denominations carry the portrait of the Kaiser in military uniform. The reverses consist of geometric patterns containing the bank name with the denomination in words and numerals. The notes mostly circulated in the coastal cities, though they could be found throughout most of the colony, though coins were preferred in the interior. The last shipment of banknotes arrived in Dar es Salaam aboard the blockade runner Marie von Stettin just prior to the port's capture in 1916. So the notes were in significant use throughout that period. And here's some examples. There's the reverse of the 100, which is the same as you'd see on the 550 rupee notes. Here's the 5 with a wonderful scene of the lions in a vignette. And the reverse, just a geometric design. Now we'll go on to World War I. At the outbreak of World War I, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck had just been made commander-in-chief of the military forces in German East Africa earlier in the year. He had 218 white officers and NCOs with 2,542 askaris, which were the native troops under his command. Von Lettow was the scion of a famous Prussian military family, and his military experience included action in the Boxer Rebellion and in German Southwest Africa, Namibia, during the Hottentot Herero Rebellion of 1904 and 1908. But it is his exploits in German East Africa during World War I for which he is renowned. He was one of the very few German leaders of World War I to be generally acclaimed a hero by both sides in the conflict, the only undefeated German leader, German general, including those of Allied generals who fought against him. His direct enemies considered him to be an honorable man and showed him quite a lot of respect. For over 4 years during World War I, he kept large Allied forces chasing him, but always succeeded in defeating or avoiding enemy attacks and evading capture or destruction with a minuscule force in comparison to those arrayed against him. In fact, today, his tactics in guerrilla warfare are still being taught at places like West Point as classic examples of what to do in a situation where you're seriously outnumbered and trying to hold down a large enemy force. Von Lettow had only sporadic communication with his government after the commencement of hostilities in 1914, and no communication whatsoever after 1916. There were lots of amazing stories of blockade runners like the Marie von Stettin mentioned earlier, and even, and this story has always fascinated me, they sent a one of the German blimps all the way across Africa in an attempt to resupply von Leto's forces in late 1916. They sent it across Bulgaria, all the way across the Mediterranean and into the western portions of Egypt before they lost contact with the last radio station in East Africa and decided to turn back. But what an amazing trip for a Zeppelin to try to get all the way down there. But it's part of the stories that make this area so interesting. So von Leto's mission was to use hit-and-run tactics to tie down as many Allied troops in East Africa as possible and thus prevent their joining the fighting in Europe. Over 130 different generals and their soldiers from Britain, Belgium, Portugal, South Africa, and India, as well as African colonial troops, went into action against the maximum of 15,000 German East African soldiers during the course of World War I. At times, the Allied forces in the theater totaled well over 150,000 men. The campaign took place over a vast stretch of East Africa, stretching from modern Kenya south to Mozambique and west to the lakes of Central Africa, an area larger than the eastern United States, and resulted in amazing adventures, which have since formed the basis for movies, as I mentioned before, such as the 1953 African Queen and Out of Africa. And you can see on the map the crisscrossing of all the different troops as they marched back and forth across the terrain, chasing after von Lettow-Vorbeck and his forces. Now we'll go on and look at some of the wartime coinage. Now, salvaging parts from the scuttled-like cruiser Königsberg, which had ended up in German East Africa at the start of the war, and the wrecks of several blockade runners, the Germans produced a crude coin press in 1916. This press was set up in Tabora, which, due to the threat of the impending British occupation of Dar es Salaam, which was occupied by the end of 1916, was fast becoming the administrative capital of German East Africa. The authorities found die makers from among the merchant shops in Dar es Salaam to design new 5 and 20 Heller coins for a provisional issue. The colonial government was able to survive and be active through the first half of World War I until basically the end of 1916. And as such, they needed money, and they were able to produce these coins in order to keep operations going. Since the machinery was so crude, frequent breakdowns and delays were encountered. The copper for this mintage was obtained from spent cartridges and artillery shell casings, and the gold from limited local resources. The 5 Heller and 20 Heller obverse depict an imperial crown with a date 1916 at center and DOA below. The reverse has the value at center surrounded by 2 crossed laurel branches. 2 types of the brass provisional 5 Heller coins exist. 30,000 of the 5 Heller coins were struck, and the 20 Heller includes a total of 12 varieties, 6 of brass and 6 of bronze. A total of 300,000 brass and 1,600,000 copper 20 Heller pieces were produced before the Tabora Mint fell to the invading Belgian army. So typical for the Germans, they kept intricate records of everything they did, and including the mintages of these coins, these emergency pieces during the war. The last coins to be struck at the Tabora Mint were the Tabora sovereigns. These coins became relatively famous in the area because a fair number of them were produced, but the conditions under which they were produced and the need for them meant that they got distributed and used well after the war for a number of years before they were basically melted down where possible or kept as souvenirs. These gold 15 rupee coins are dated 1916 and were equivalent to the English sovereign, which was the legal tender in British East Africa and Zanzibar. Governor Schnee, who was the governor of the colony during the war, authorized the use of the gold, which was available from the Sekeke mine close to Tabora. It wasn't a hugely productive mine, but it did produce gold, and they had accumulated bullion worth 1 million gold marks by the time the coinage began to be struck. The obverse of the gold coin depicts the crowned imperial German eagle with a circle of dots with Deutsche Ostafrika above and 15 Rupian below. On the reverse is a wonderful image of a trumpeting elephant with mountains for a background. I've always thought this image was perhaps a little crude, but extremely representative of what was going on. This is a pretty amazing work, considering the amateur nature of the people creating the coins. The date 1916 and the T mint mark appear below. At that time, Tabora was the center of the ivory trade, so the choice of an elephant for the reverse was appropriate. And here you see the different types. You see the 5 Heller coins, less often the 20 Hellers. The 5 Hellers come in a thick and a thin planchet variety, as do the 20 Heller pieces, and then the 20 Heller pieces show the different metals of either brass or bronze. Both of them were in part created from the shells that had been brought by the Königsberg, whose guns had been taken off and used as field artillery. With the flow of money from Germany having been cut off, a shortage of coins quickly developed as hoarding became common. By early 1915, the situation had become critical, forcing Governor Schnee to order the Deutsche Ostafrikanische Bank to print an interim money supply. The issue of these interim banknoten was restricted to the duration of the war. How and where were the notes printed? A good question, because with no local paper manufacturing and limited local printing capability, what were you to do? The paper supply problem was alleviated by one of the last blockade runners to arrive in the colony. It brought a large supply of several different kinds of durable paper that could be used to print reasonably uniform bills of exchange. Equipment already existed in the colony, which after adaptation could be used for printing paper money. This machinery belonged to the firm of Deutsche Ostafrikanische Zeitung, publishers of the daily Dar es Salaam newspaper. A contract was then awarded to the newspaper to immediately commence printing the colony's banknotes. The first of these, the 20 Rupian notes, appeared in March 1915. Soon thereafter, the presses were busily engaged in running off series after series of 1, 5, 10, 50, and 200 Rupian interim banknotes as well. The Deutsche Ostafrikanische Bank decided to print interim notes at Dar es Salaam and Tabora simultaneously for security reasons, starting at Dar es Salaam. Between 1915 and 1917, emergency notes were issued in denominations of 1, 5, 10, 20, 50, and 200 Rupian. So here's an example of the first issue of the 20 Rupian notes by the bank. You can see that they're much simpler than the older notes, but then they're using basically newspaper printing presses without having the advantage of some of the more advanced printing techniques available in Europe. And the reverse is very simple, basically warnings of what the note can be used for and how long they were good for. Here you go with a 5 rupee note of the August issue. Again, simple reverse serial number used to identify each note. Then you have the 1 rupee, which were issued in large numbers. This is the February 1916 issue with the signatures. And it's been counterstamped. And then here's one of the really crude pieces that you get later in 1917. This is a series of emergency money produced while fighting in the veldt with the troops. So these are referred as Bush notes because these printing presses were actually carried with the troops, and the notes printed in order to pay them and to buy resources, supplies from the local villages and towns. There were only four denominations: the 1, 5, 10, and 50 rupiah notes, and they bore the inscription "Interim's banknote," as did their predecessors. All are dated 1 July 1917, except for the 50 rupiah, which carries a date of 1 October. The notes were hand-signed by bank officials Stelling and Kirst, who accompanied the armies, and meticulously numbered as they had been before. They contained the simple phrase, "Wir zahlen gegen dies Note." We count this note as, and then the denomination. So basically, they're saying that these notes were a legal obligation on the bank and would be repaid. And here's the reverse. So these are very simple, very crude notes, but they were used, and it's not, they're quite rare today because most of them ended up in out of the way places and under the conditions in the different areas of German East Africa, especially the jungle conditions, they rotted fairly easily. Now, back to the history and stories here. I mentioned the SMS Königsberg, and I figure this is one of the interesting stories that's worth telling. And it does have a numismatic angle, since the shells from the Königsberg were reused in order to make some of the wartime coinage. In August of 1914, the British made a preemptive strike against Dar es Salaam, hoping the colony would surrender. Overruling the colonial governor Schnee, who was inclined towards a truce, von Lettow-Vorbeck took the fight to British East Africa, where he inflicted heavy losses. In June of 1914, the cruiser Königsberg, so before the war, had been sent out to German East Africa as part of the celebrations of the opening of the Central Railway. She was modern and sleek and meant to serve as a symbol of German naval power in the region. The arrival of the Königsberg posed a threat to the Royal Navy and to England's maritime trade should war break out. To protect their interests, the British maintained 3 old cruisers on station at Simonstown in South Africa. They were to prove no match for Königsberg. Prepared for her role as a sea raider, Captain Max Loof had no wish to be caught in port should the war be declared. So on the 31st of July, he put out to sea. The next day, during heavy rain squall, Königsberg narrowly escaped the British Cape Squadron, which had been sent up to intercept her. War having been declared, Loof headed north to interdict the sea lanes in the Gulf of Aden. Within days, she had captured and sunk the city of Winchester, the first merchant ship casualty of the war. On the 20th of September of 1914, she surprised and sank the British protected cruiser HMS Pegasus in the Battle of Zanzibar, which was a pretty audacious feat, since the British cruiser, though much older than the Königsberg, was much more heavily armed and armored. So this was considered a great success and created a lot of panic amongst the German naval authorities as they tried to figure out how to crush this threat to their trade. The picture is a great picture of the Königsberg just off the coast outside of Dar es Salaam. Now, what happened to the Königsberg after these events, basically, it was forced to come back to Dar es Salaam, which had the only facilities capable of completing repairs and needed maintenance. In early 1915, the British British patrols were too prevalent. So what they decided to do was send the Königsberg down south to the Rufiji River Delta, which was a huge delta area, essentially 100 miles or more across the whole of the region. Well, not 100. It was a very wide region of over 100 square miles, I'm sorry. And the Germans found a location along one of the branches of the river and sent the repair facilities from Dar es Salaam to the Rufiji to begin the repairs. From the British point of view, the Königsberg had vanished without a trace, and they spent months trying to figure out where it was, also creating new stories as they experimented with how to operate seaplanes in 1915, late 1914 and early 1915 for the first time in tropical conditions. Turns out there was a lot of problems because the early seaplanes weren't powerful enough to take off in the heat and humidity, and it took them a little while to figure that out. But eventually, the British did find the Königsberg and started a campaign to try to destroy or capture her. The Königsberg retreated further into the delta to repair her engines, but before the repairs could be completed, the British cruisers located her and, unable to steam into the river to destroy her, set up a blockade. After several attempts to sink the ship during the Battle of the Rufiji Delta, where the British sent troops up the river and had to fight against machine gun nests and artillery emplacements, the British sent 2 monitors from England. The monitors were basically very shallow draft ships armed with 2 very heavy guns, but they were capable of sailing up the very shallow branches of the river. So the Mersey and Severn were sent to destroy the German cruiser. And on 11th July, after 6 months of traversing the Atlantic and going around the Cape of Good Hope and all that, the monitors got close enough to severely damage the Königsberg, forcing her crew to scuttle the ship. The surviving crew salvaged all 10 of her 4.1-inch main guns and joined Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's guerrilla campaign in East Africa, becoming the artillerist manning their guns. Königsberg was partially broken up in 1963 through 1965 for scrap, and the remains sank into the riverbed, where they can be seen even today, apparently. And here's some shots of the different parts of the campaign. You see the Königsberg on the upper right, listing as it had been pounded into sinking onto the riverbed at that point. One of the guns down to the lower right appears with its field mounting. Now, it's interesting is these guns enabled the Germans to attack heavily fortified positions when necessary, and at least 4 of the guns are still on display at various capitals in East and South Africa to this day. And here's again a 20 Heller piece made, perhaps in this case, from the shells of the Königsberg guns. General von Lettow-Vorbeck was never defeated in battle and only surrendered after learning about the armistice 3 days after the cessation of fighting. Von Lettow-Vorbeck finally surrendered on 25th November 1918, 2 weeks after the official armistice of 11th November at Abercorn in modern Zambia. At the time of the surrender, 155 Germans and 1,168 Askaris laid down their arms and were granted full honors of war. The British repatriated the white German soldiers, but confined the Askaris in squalid camps. German General von Lettow refused to leave East Africa until he had won guarantees for the decent treatment and early release of his black troops. So he created a bit of an embarrassment for the British authorities in that he refused to leave until he was able to verify that his troops were being treated decently, which is one of the reasons why he was as successful as he was, because he engendered loyalty even among these African troops who had little understanding of what was going on in Europe, and certainly no reason to be all that excited to be fighting for one side or the other. Returning to Germany as a national hero, von Lettow-Vorbeck became active in politics and tried to establish a conservative opposition to the Nazis. He was able to bring some of his black officers with him to serve in the German Freikorps in the 1919-1920 period, when Hitler offered him the ambassadorship to the court of St. James, i.e. The capital of Great Britain in London, in 1935. He told Hitler, well, basically to F himself, excuse me. Although repeatedly harassed by the Nazis, he survived the regime due to his popularity as a genuine hero of the old school, though his pension was inadequate, and amazingly enough, his erstwhile enemies, General Smuts and a couple of the generals of the British Army, sent him care packages during the 1930s in order to help him get through. The old general never did forget his Oscares, and he returned to East Africa in 1953, where his surviving soldiers tearfully welcomed him by carrying him through the streets. He had arrived at the dock at Dar es Salaam, and as he got off the ship and walked towards the shore, he noticed a large number of older Africans, and he spoke to them in Swahili, and they recognized who he was, and they put him on his shoulders and carried him off through the town, leaving the British authorities a little dumbstruck as far as what to do next. He showed up later in the day at the governor's palace and attended the ceremonies that the British had waiting for him. But it's very interesting that he engendered that kind of loyalty even some 35, 36 years after the war. Upon returning to Europe, he campaigned to provide for their welfare. When von Lettow-Vorbeck died at the age of 93 in 1964, the West German government and the Bundeswehr flew 2 former Oscaris as state guests so that they could attend the funeral of their general. Interestingly, the final chapter of that came in 1964 when the Bundesbank was authorized to pay the back pay of von Lettow's veterans, and with the result that they went to East Africa. The British authorities were amused at this attempt to pay the back pay for the surviving troops, and said, well, everybody from the backwoods is going to be coming in and claiming their pay. The simple solution was for the German banker to give each of the soldiers, 350 had shown up, give each of the soldiers a broom and take them through the German manual of arms. All 350 of them did it perfectly and received their back pay. So now we'll talk about the immediate aftermath of the war. Germany experienced a period in the 1920s when cities and small towns all issued their own emergency money called notgeld. This is the period when hyperinflation hit Germany, in part because of the reparations demands of France and England and their other erstwhile enemies, which crippled the German ability to recover. So notgeld was issued as a way to supplement the government money, which was being overproduced and suffering huge inflation. Now, Berlin notgeld in the amount of 75 Pfennig, dated March 31st, 1922, like this, commemorates the German Hanseatic Colonial Remembrance Day. All obverses in the series are alike. So one of the things that they did was issue coinage in commemoration of their lost colonies, and they issued notes to celebrate each of them. One of the series is this one where they celebrated the various founders of the German colonies. So Namibia, for example, was first settled by the German merchant Adolf Luderitz in 1883, and it became a German colony in 1884. Karl Peters, who we mentioned earlier, was the most significant German in the establishment of German East Africa, despite his brutality. Wisman colonized the rest of the German East Africa until he returned to Germany and was remembered as a benevolent leader. And in stark contrast with Karl Peters, Wisman treated the indigenous peoples with respect and insisted on fairness and respect for customs and the use of Swahili, the most widespread of the native languages in the region. And he became Germany's greatest African, and because of that, several monuments were erected to commemorate his accomplishments, some of which are still in place. We have von Bismarck as the chancellor, was the person who oversaw the creation of the colonies, even though he was not an enthusiast for them. Karl Peters, von Wisman, A. Luderitz, and von Lettow-Vorbeck. So these notes are all very collectible and somewhat available in this series. Then we have the Deutsch Hanseatischer Colonials Gedenktag, the thank you remembrance of these by the old passenger line. So you have one for each colony: Deutsche Ostafrika, Südwest Africa, Namibia, Cameroon, which is in the Gold Coast, Togo, also in that area, and the colony in China, Cao Chau, and Deutsches Südsee and Inseln, which is the South Sea Islands, the Pacific. So a few months after von Lettow's death, the old warrior's fondest wish became reality when West German Bundestag voted to deliver back to the 350 surviving Askaris in Africa. They delivered their back pay. The Weimar Republic had provided pension payments to the German Askaris, but due to the interruptions during the Great Depression and World War II, the Parliament of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, because they were interrupted during that time, West Germany voted in 1964 to fund the back pay of the Askaris still alive. The West German embassy at Dar es Salaam identified approximately 350 of these ex-Askaris and set up a temporary cashier's office at Mwanza on Lake Victoria. Since so few of the claimants could produce the certificates which had been given them in 1918, guaranteeing them, showing that they had served in the German forces, these things are extremely rare and would be very collectible if you could find one. I've never seen one, but what the soldiers did was they provided pieces of their old uniform in some cases. Some were unable to do anything, and this is where you get the banker who had brought the money coming up with the idea of having each claimant step forward and go through the German manual of arms to prove that they were indeed former Askaris. And with that, we will close our exploration of the history and money of German East Africa. If you have any questions, please ask them at this point. We should be able to answer them.
Yes, so I'm going to go ahead and have you turn off your screen share. We'll leave the references up for a minute and then I'll turn it off.
Yep.
So for audience members, go ahead and send in any questions. There's a button at the bottom of your Zoom window that says Q&A. Pull that up. There's a box to type in. And all of them will be read off anonymously, so you don't need to worry about your name being read off as well. So, okay, let's go ahead and
share right now.
There we go. All right, and we have one in here to start off with. Where would you recommend a new collector start?
Well, you can find, as far as basic information, the place to start would be the Krause publication, the World Catalog, the World Catalog of Coins, and also paper money, because the German East Africa coins and notes are listed in there. So that will give you a starting point as far as figuring out what to collect. As far as collecting them, they are available at the larger shows. You'll normally find some of the dealers will have them. I don't have anybody on the tip of my tongue at the moment, but Scott Luce, for example, will have some occasionally. There's other dealers, basically not your heritages and large dealers, but the dealers that go to the larger shows on a regular basis tend to have a few of them at least. Generally, they're not terribly expensive. You do see them come up at auctions. Stephen Album, for example, his auctions will often have a few examples. Other than the 2 rupee and some of the notes, they're generally pretty available and relatively inexpensive.
Alrighty. How does the composition of the shell casings Heller compare to the World War II shell casing Lincoln sent?
It's very similar, but I'm not familiar with exactly the composition of both, in that shell casings are designed to hold up well when you fire them and all that, and so there's a certain type of brass that is the right mixture to make them solid enough. So they're similar in that sense, but the exact mixture varies from country to country, in part because of what metals might be more available. Brass is basically copper mixed with tin and then some other metals, depending on what kind of strength or flexibility you want the brass or bronze to be.
Alrighty. Do grading services typically accept these pieces?
Yes, you do find them graded. I haven't found very many of them graded, though. Typically, I'll find them raw, partly because other than some of the small silver and the rupees, for example, the value is low enough where the cost of slabbing them becomes more than most people are willing to do. It's also a niche area, and it's the kind of thing where people are less interested in the grade and value than they are the history and just being able to handle and see such interesting pieces.
All right, that's the last one that we had in here for now. So if you're in the audience, go ahead and send in questions quickly. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap us up, and then we'll come back if there are any questions at the end of my little spiel. So thank you very much, Douglas, for taking the time out to come present for us. Always love having some interesting world coins and currency to add to the mix. So it's very much appreciated.
Yeah, I find this to be a really interesting area, not only because it has a wide variety of pieces, and some of them are quite challenging to find, the paper money especially, but the stories behind them really make this interesting. The idea of having a Zeppelin going across half of Africa to provide supplies to this small army in the middle of nowhere, and then the stories that are associated with this. There's even a book about the British successful attempt to take over Lake Tanganyika from the German domination. It's called Mimi and Tutu's Adventure, because the 2 motorboats that were sent were named Mimi and Tutu as part of the camouflage of, to keep the secrecy of the project. But there was an adventure that the African Queen basically is based on, where you have 2 motorboats being sent through thousands of, a couple thousand miles of African jungle to arrive on the lake. So there's a lot of interesting stories and battles that were interrupted by African bees as the troops go fleeing across the battlefield because the African bees got upset and everybody's running away.
All right, we do have a couple new things in the Q&A, so we'll go back to those. What people signed the notes during the war? Was it all the same people, or did it vary greatly?
So the German, so the bank, the Bundes, well, not the Bundesbank, but the German East Africa Bank was still operational through the end of 1916. And so the notes were signed by the same people that had signed them previously. So they were officials from the bank. For the emergency issues, you would get the governor of the colony, Governor Schnee. Sometimes you would get von Lettow-Vorbeck for the field notes. But there were two officials from the bank that accompanied at least a couple of the columns that were operating in the bush. So they actually had a small printing press that was going with them to print the emergency issues that I showed the one example of. They're quite rare, and they signed those notes. So it must have been very interesting. What's your part in the war? Well, I'm a bank official, and I'm supposed to sign these emergency notes, and that's what I did during the war. Pretty amazing when you consider the type of terrain that they went through. It was very arduous. They were going through jungles, through scrub brush that was, rife with disease. The most European troops or officers and NCOs that von Lettow-Vorbeck had under his command was up to 3,000 at the highest number. When he surrendered his army, basically there were about 1,500 men with about 300, just under 300 Europeans, and the rest were all African soldiers. That was the hardcore of what was left over once they basically cut down to try to make themselves as mobile as possible. And they were actually found, the British sent out bicycle riders trying to find them to give them the newspaper, because that was the only proof that they could give, saying, hey, the war's over. And it was difficult because even at that point they were having trouble figuring out where he was, and they had thousands of troops chasing after him.
Mm-hmm. Very different times. We have to hunt someone down on a bicycle to deliver news.
Yes.
Let's see, we just have a comment. There are a number of dealers offering these coins on MA shops. Okay,
yeah. The MA shops, you can get them. Those are, it's German based, so they have a better source. There are more of the pieces available on the German market than there are on the US market. But there are about 5 or 6 American dealers you can reliably find them at. I just don't have them at the tip of my tongue.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, then that, I believe, will close us out. Thank you again for taking the time out to present, and for everyone watching, thank you for joining. We do have 2 more presentations starting at 4. Their names are over here. We've got George Anastasopoulos and Eric Sheena coming up at 4. So take a look at the schedule. You're welcome to join in either of those. We have one other one after those 2 tonight, and then we'll be back bright and early in the morning.
Thank you, Leanna. Thank you for moderating, and thanks to the ANMP for making this symposium possible. This is a great program.
Yeah, we're very grateful to Epinus for funding the entire thing. They've enabled us to make it free for everyone to participate. So we're very grateful to them for letting us have this. So thank you all. Everyone keep attending things, and we'll keep having symposia in the future. So that's going to wrap us up. Hope to see some familiar names in the list at later presentations, and have a good evening.